Obsidian is an old enough developer that they have created a bare minimum of quality for their works. If one, say, goes to Steam and starts scrolling past games with the RPG tag, you'll find that this minimum of quality beats most of them. But that doesn't get Obsidian off the hook though. Most people who watch movies have that director for which they always go to see the latest release, be it Tarantino, Park Chan-wook, the Coen brothers, etc. A mediocre run-of-the-mill film is immediately seen as a failure. Call it the curse of pedigree, but Obsidian is in the same boat. Things are expected of them. The main selling point of their latest effort, Tyranny, is that evil won. The fantasy world in which it takes place is almost entirely under the rule of an immortal overlord called Kairos. The main narrative concerns itself with the conquest and occupation of the last free lands, with the player working for the Empire as an enforcer of the law. RPGs are steeped in the orthodoxy of high fantasy world-saving plots, and I relish every time developers try to deviate from the norm. However, for each step forward, this game goes too backwards. If there is one singular moment which encapsulates the core problem with Tyranny, it is this.
As always, you will be held accountable for what you do in the court's name. But you are free to conduct your investigation in the manner of your choosing. You are free to conduct your investigation.
The story contrives itself to a frankly ludicrous degree to give the player freedom and make them a generic adventurer in all but name. Never will you feel constrained, never will someone pull rank on your character and make you feel like a cog in the machine. The narrative is blatantly written for the world to revolve around the player's choices, and it all devolves into a chosen one plot that ruins any thematic weight this title could have produced. If you approach more serious topics, you must have the writing chops to do them justice. Imagine a work of fiction that handled the Iraq occupation but solely concerned itself with insurgents, and attention to civilian elements was a distant thought. It would feel disingenuous, and that is how Tyranny feels. For the vast majority of this game, the player will mostly fight seasoned, die-hard combatants, whether it is rebels, mercenaries, or Kairos' army. It reminded me of grim, stupid settings like Warhammer, where everybody is angry and wants to kill each other, rather than any serious portrayal of war, domination, and occupation. The main plot threads are about finding magical artifacts of great power, fighting ancient monsters, or dealing with titanic demigods that reshape the land. This is high fantasy schlock of the highest order, which, don't get me wrong, it is fine if you are doing a generic fantasy premise, but Tyranny sold itself as being different. Obsidian started with the evil has won paradigm for their world and then turned it into a facade by cramming as many familiar elements as possible rather than fully exploring what it would mean to serve a ruthless empire and be part of its hierarchy. There are moments where the game takes a step back from all the slaughter and lets you be a mediator between people, or have to face harder decisions such as whether to execute villagers as a warning to others. There is a scene at one point where a colleague breaks the law by killing some soldiers who are raping a prisoner, and the main character can use a legal loophole to not punish this person. These sorts of decisions and situations should have been the core of the game, not seeing endless amounts of veteran-on-veteran action sprinkled with ancient magic of unfathomable power. In regards to world building, it is a generic fantasy world with some sorely missed opportunities. The setting was supposed to be inspired by the Bronze Age Mediterranean culture, but that is just flat out not true. Google Bronze Age and you can quickly see this is not how Tyranny looks at all. This castle, the interior, this village, it is as generic as medieval fantasy gets. The only exception is that there is indeed both iron and bronze equipment present, with the latter being better, although not necessarily accurate. The difference between cast iron and bronze is one of production, not quality. Overall, it makes for an interesting world building point, but it doesn't really evolve beyond that. But probably my biggest disappointment when it comes to world building is the magic system. It is based around demigods called archons who can use a specific type of magic and pass it on in a lesser form through magical signs. Kairos employs archons as generals and governors, but here the name denotes a function. Thus the confusion starts. You meet the Archon of War, but we learn he wasn't the first to bear this title, and his predecessor had different abilities. On the other hand, you meet the Archon of Shadows who works as an assassin, but his title refers directly to his abilities, which is manipulating shadows. On top of all of that, you have mage smiths that can enchant objects, legendary items that seem to gain powers all on their own, and magical monsters, none of which are tied into the whole sign system. It is clear the writers got lost within their own world. Out of all of the Archons you meet in the game, only one has its respective symbol present in gameplay, which raises some head-scratching questions. The main character is a direct subordinate to the Archon of Justice, but in no situation, not even in combat, will you know what his domain of magic is. You would think he would teach his direct subordinate his particular school of magic, no? Not to mention, there is a mage who specializes in moonlight magic, which can be taught, but it also gives power over water and tides, which cannot be taught for some reason. This state of affairs saddens me greatly, since coherent magical systems are something of a rarity in fiction, and this one had great potential. With all this talk of writing, I should really press that there are some outstandingly amateurish technical flaws. The stylistics of dialogue and description are far too modern for the intended time period. There are moments when high-ranking officials use words such as old chum, or even your own character can say what gives. That doesn't mean that you should use ye olde English like the Ultima games, but if you read Moorcock or Glenn Cook, I think you can find that this can be done right. Speaking of Glenn Cook, the famous fantasy author's The Black Company is a clear influence, but given the aforementioned power fantasy of the game rather than the bottom to top view of the books, it is clear that the writers didn't understand what made the Black Company tick. And of course, there is also just plain bad writing. There is a murder case that you must investigate revolving around a lesbian marriage where the culprit killed her spouse for money. When confronted, she says, "I wanted to show her life can be mean and cruel so she'd stop smiling all the damn time. The dead do not smile." This is melodramatic garbage of the highest level, and the whole situation highlights another instance of bad writing. The option to punish the killer is presented as, "I've heard enough, you disgust me." You're supposed to be this lawyer slash prosecutor slash executioner who must civilize the conquered land by applying Kairos' law. Your character should be staging public executions to demonstrate the power of the law, not just attack people in the streets. At the very least, there should be some variant of "you are under arrest." And if the game didn't take the law angle seriously, they should have at least allowed you to go Judge Dredd on people and do scenes like this.
How do you plead? Defense noted.
But then again, I'm not holding high hopes from the writer and creative director who managed to allow kills in shadow to exist. I'm gonna say it again, kills in shadow. What does that conjure in your mind? It's worse. It is this stereotypically Native American beast woman companion that would make Saturday morning cartoons blush with how cliché she is. And please note, Kills in Shadow isn't even a nickname, it's her birth name. It is like having a child named Fire McBurn and they grow up to be an arsonist. Genre fiction doesn't mean you can get away with horrible writing. I wish more people would understand this. Kills in Shadow doesn't tell us anything that we wouldn't already know by looking at the beast in question. Try to at least have an interesting name even if you go with this ham-fisted approach. Anyway, the last thing I want to mention regarding writing is that Tyranny has one of the worst cases of what I like to call level 1 god syndrome. What might that be? It is when the background describes a powerhouse while the gameplay portrays a wimp. People make fun of games like The Witcher where the protagonist has amnesia to erase an entire book series worth of experience, but at least they were trying to solve an issue. Tyranny has a prologue that defines your character's involvement in the war effort, and there are possibilities such as assassinating the leaders of an entire city to governing a settlement. The character you create could easily be portrayed as a level 20 epic hero slash villain in Dungeons & Dragons, but when the game starts proper, all that amazing background amounts to basically nothing. That is not to say that the prologue doesn't have consequences, but rather that you're playing a different character after the choose your own adventure segment. You are a famous war hero that has worse equipment than the average foot soldier, and you don't even have a retinue even though the high importance role you are assigned is administrative. Obviously having difference in what the game says and how the game plays is common, but Tyranny is just jarring in this regard. And on that note, let's transition into talking about the gameplay proper. Obsidian's previous RPG was a callback to the Infinity Engine games, namely Pillars of Eternity, click here for the best review ever. Tyranny is built upon the skeleton of that, so you pretty much know what to expect. The exploring, talking and fighting are par for the course. But the devil is in the details with these sorts of games, so while they may seem superficially similar, they can actually provide very different experiences. One of Tyranny's most striking features is something simple but quite effective: hyperlinks. Some words are highlighted and when hovered over, a pop-up explains the term. It is an evolution of the wiki-style dialogue that Morrowind used to do, and it is surprisingly underutilized. It does an excellent job of fixing the gap between player and character knowledge without breaking the flow of the game. Of course, that doesn't mean it is perfect. Sometimes the writer got carried away and the pop-up can have so much text that an additional click is required to see the full text in a window, which can mess with the flow. And sometimes the writers got incredibly carried away, with some text boxes being so full of hyperlinks that reading the damn thing becomes a chore. You know what fixes this? Different colors for visited links, preferably text white. I have no idea how this simple feature was not implemented. Still, I wouldn't mind seeing this sort of thing have more widespread use. It made the game better. Reputation is also worthy of praise. Tyranny focuses and frames much of its narrative through faction dynamics, similarly to one of Obsidian's previous titles, Fallout New Vegas. Both negative and positive modifiers are added together to form the disposition towards the protagonist. What is interesting is that they extend the system to companions and other important characters. Thus, it is theoretically possible for a faction to like you, but the leader of that faction to dislike you. Even new abilities get unlocked when reaching certain points. It is a good system for a game that wants to accentuate choice and consequence decisions. But sadly, it is all undermined by one simple fact: choice and consequence means nothing without context. By which I mean is that all of the complaints I have about writing just drag everything down. Tyranny has the skeleton of a game with powerful choices, just not the meat. The game is structured in 3 acts with 4 choices at the end of the first act that decide the character's path throughout the rest of the game. Afterwards, it is a pretty linear affair with several small deviations that are taken into account in the ending slides, similar to games such as Fallout. From a purely structural perspective, Tyranny does give the player old school choice and different outcomes. You can kill almost everyone in the game if all paths are taken into account. But they are pretty stale overall and sometimes horribly telegraphed. For example, it is possible to be put in the situation where a village needs to be defended, and there are several choices to make about who or what receives your help, but it is all presented by having everything crammed into the same screen. It undermines the illusion of choice games strive for and makes it feel mechanical, as if you're choosing A or B. With all that being said, sadly, we must get to the less redeeming parts of the game. Combat is conceptually broken. It combines the real-time with pause style used by the Infinity Engine games with the single-character hotbar MMO style we all know and love. The idea behind hotbar combat is about having a rotation of abilities that maximizes the given role of your character, with the occasional situational ability coming into play. The Infinity Engine games, on the other hand, revolve around positioning several characters, most of whom use very simple commands. Only the magical characters require micromanagement to properly utilize. Tyranny takes the worst from both these worlds. The player controls a maximum of 4 characters at a time, but each and every one of them have increasingly large ability pools, which require a lot of micromanagement, much more than the 6 of the Infinity Engine games. At the beginning it is relatively manageable, but as the game goes on, every one of your characters accrues a large amount of abilities. Anecdotally, when I finished the game on the hardest difficulty, only the support healing character had decisions which made me think, but I still had to individually select their abilities every few seconds. I should also add that the interface is every bit as cluttered as the Pillars of Eternity one, which doesn't help at all when you have to go through your rotations. What amazes me is how easily this issue could have been lessened by the banal inclusions of queues. Allowing players to queue up abilities would have straight up made Tyranny a far better game than it is now. I know there are preset AI settings, but they're a joke. The pathfinding issues combined with the fact that it likes to just randomly use normal attacks instead of abilities in sequence means that the gap between the AI and player control is enormous. Not to mention that engagement from Pillars of Eternity makes a return, so every time a character disengages, the enemies around them have a free hit. Even with the AI disabled, characters tend to get smacked about due to the terrible pathfinding. It is immensely grating when your characters get hit by disengagement when you don't want them to. Of course, the system is only half when it comes to combat. Encounter design is the other half. I think this is where the budget limits are shown the most, since 80% of all combat encounters are against other human squads, while the others are fought against foe elementals and beastmen. The lackluster encounter design was one of the biggest weaknesses that the original Pillars of Eternity campaign had. It is somewhat pathetic that the developers of games such as Blackguards, Underrail, and Age of Decadence have much less experience in making RPGs, and yet they did well from the get-go, while Fame named Obsidian can't make a consistent average progression of encounters even if their lives depended on it. A lot of it has to do with the lack of meaningful crowd control. Most of the combat encounters revolve around DPS races combined with burst healing, or cheating on the hardest difficulty by abusing kiting. It is almost mandatory since Obsidian's idea of difficulty is tweaking the numbers so that every enemy combatant is built like a tank and hits like a train, which makes things even more samey, if that is even possible. Now, the following is more of a personal complaint, I know, but I really dislike the fantasy superhero aesthetic that combat embraces. Enemies have names such as Resolute Blade, Scarlet Fury, or Crescent Runner. Nobody is just called Swordsman or Infantry. I don't know if the Tyranny crew knew this, but the Infinity Engine experience was much more toned down and somewhat more realistic. And it's not like this is some brave artistic reinvention. The Blizzard and JRPG style way of doing things with particle effects everywhere, plus casually breaking the laws of physics, is the industry standard. On top of all that I have mentioned up till now, there is a smorgasbord of uneven design when it comes to progress. It feels like the people who made this game just threw all ideas possible to make a progress system. Characters gain experience to level up, then assign 1 point to D&D style attributes and 1 point to a by the numbers talent tree. There must be skills that must be trained through use, like say Darklands, plus skill trainers like in the Elder Scrolls. 3 of these skills show up in dialogue, which incentivizes continually using them without any added thought. And of course, the itemization of pillars is back in full force. Staring at the screen for 5 minutes trying to figure out which item is the best is good, because integers are the enemy, dammit. But the crowning achievement of horrible design that Tyranny has is the level scaling. Yes, a 20 to 30 hour linear game focused on replayability has level scaled skill checks and gear. You know how the Elder Scrolls games have all major cities accessible through fast travel of some sort? This is why level scaling is introduced, because it is a non-linear experience that can start from anywhere. Tyranny is the opposite of that. It should have everything hand-placed. I know this is harsh, but I consider it pure incompetence if you just throw your hands up and level scale things in a mostly linear experience. And to make matters worse, the amount of experience you have is determined by the difficulty, because on the higher difficulties you need to do more stuff, thus your skills go up faster from use, while on the easier modes they don't, obviously. This can lead to 3 to 4 levels worth of discrepancy between the different difficulty levels. This darts against the wall design is indicative of a lack of creativity, and what makes it even sadder is the missed opportunities. Some items come with abilities and more are earned through faction reputation, like I mentioned. Imagine if Obsidian cut all of the excess design fat and focused solely on items and reputation for progress. Some reworking would have been needed, but it would have been something original in comparison to this rickety sham of a progress system. Now, to be fair, there are more things which are worthy of praise. The magic system for one. The general idea behind it is that every character has a lore skill, and this determines the spells they can craft and use. Every spell has a core which determines what type of power the spell comes from, such as stone, healing or illusion, and form which determines the function of the spell. Further sigils can be added which increase the characteristics of the spell, such as range or damage. The more powerful you make the spell, the higher the lore requirement, so simple people can only do some basic cantrips, while arcane erudites can sling about the really powerful magic. It feels much more immersive to see and play around with magical formulas rather than just finding a scroll from which characters learn their spells from. The thing that I like the most is that there is a progression to using spells that make it seem much more natural. You might use some of the same spells from the beginning to end, but they get progressively more powerful and complex. I will say though that the developers play fast and loose with the internal logic sometimes, like having a magic wind that affects you underground, finding the sigil of a 16-year-old archon in an ancient ruin, which should be impossible, or having a companion from a legion where everybody has a specific magical buff except him. These are world building and gameplay inconsistencies, but overall I feel like this system can be put to much better use, and I hope it reappears in a different game which will make it shine. Tyranny also does a much better job than Pillars when it comes to player strongholds. Multiple such locations called spires come under the control of the player, and each opens up new options for crafting, researching and upgrading items. It is not amazing, but relatively well integrated. The big issue with it though either condemns or saves Obsidians in the eyes of many. Whether funds ran out or publisher interference, the game is clearly unfinished. The art book reveals the existence of a chapter 4 and 5 while the game ends on 3. Spires and magic are the most affected by this, since when you unlock all the spires and and can craft the really cool spell, the game basically ends. This is decidedly not okay for the price tag, and you can introduce a few insults here if Obsidian releases endgame DLC after this video is released. Look, even if you have a trilogy in mind, you can still end the story on a satisfying note. See Star Wars A New Hope. Before finishing up, let's go through the production side of things. The game looks relatively fine, but far below Pillars of Eternity, which is surprising given that was probably the best part of that game. This crying statue is the most visually interesting thing Tyranny has to offer. The rest is just sort of barren and lacking in detail. And while I admit that this is a personal pet peeve, I intensely dislike the 3D portraits, instead of the classical drawn portraits this type of game generally uses. Even though the 3D ones move about, they just aren't as expressive. But all of that is a blessing compared to the music. I have no idea who thought this was even remotely okay. Some tracks are fine, but quite a few have this absolutely grating horn motif, such as the main menu music. I remember booting the game and configuring the options menu for the first time only to have to stop to disable the damn sound. I don't want to bash the composer since I don't really blame him, but rather those in charge of the game's direction. Other than that, I only crashed a few times and the bugs weren't anything special, but the loading times are atrocious, even for a Unity game. Sometimes it took over 30 seconds and I have a solid state disk. I pity those who don't. I've heard complaints ranging into multiple minutes per loading. In the end, Tyranny is not a game about moral dilemmas, the atrocities of war, the validity of invading as a civilizational force, or even a story about evil winning. No, Tyranny is about how your character goes from powerful to godly in a straight up by-the-numbers power fantasy. Is it a terrible game? Not really, but a huge disappointment coming from Obsidian when it could have been so much more. Combined with how Pillars of Eternity turned out, I will just say that I don't wish to see Obsidian slip into the games with an RPG tag that are only worth ignoring.